92% of people who set goals never actually achieve them. Not because they lack discipline. Not because they are lazy. And not because their goals were too big. The real reason is something far more specific, far more fixable, and once you understand it, you will never approach goal setting the same way again. In the next 10 minutes, you are going to learn the exact framework that separates the 8% who consistently achieve what they set out to do from everyone else who sets goals in January and forgets about them by February. We will cover why most popular goal-setting advice is actually working against you, what neuroscience says about how the brain processes ambition, and there's one counterintuitive principle near the end of this video that most productivity coaches completely skip over, because it challenges the very foundation of how we are taught to think about success. Let us start with a little bit of history, because understanding where modern goal-setting came from tells you a lot about why so much of it fails. The idea of structured goal-setting became mainstream in the 1960s when psychologist Edwin Locke began publishing research on motivation and performance. His work, later expanded with Gary Latham in the 1990s, gave us what became known as goal-setting theory. The core finding was simple, specific, challenging goals lead to higher performance than vague or easy ones. That research was solid. The problem is that somewhere along the way, the nuance got stripped out, and what remained was a simplified version that left out the most important parts. By the time self-help culture fully absorbed these ideas in the 1980s and 1990s, goal setting had become almost ritualistic. Vision boards, New Year's resolutions, 5-year plans. And while none of these things are inherently bad, they were being used without the psychological infrastructure needed to support them. People were being handed the destination without the map. Here is something that rarely gets mentioned. A study published in the British Journal of Health Psychology found that people who wrote down not just their goals, but when and where they would take action, were 2 to 3 times more likely to follow through than those who only set the goal itself. That gap is enormous. And it points to the first major flaw in how most people set goals. They confuse deciding with planning. Deciding is saying, I want to run a marathon. Planning is saying, I will run every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 in the morning starting from my front door. One of those is a wish. The other is a commitment. The brain treats them very differently. When you create what psychologists call an implementation intention, a specific if-then plan attached to your goal, you essentially automate the decision-making process. You remove the daily negotiation your brain has to have with itself about whether or not to take action. But here is what nobody talks about. The size of your goal matters far less than the clarity of your first step. Research from Stanford psychologist B.J. Fogg shows that motivation is not a reliable fuel source for behavior change. It fluctuates. It disappears. What actually drives consistent action is something much smaller and much more controllable, tiny, well-defined behaviors attached to existing habits. He calls them habit anchors. You attach a new behavior to something you already do automatically, and suddenly the cognitive load of starting drops to nearly zero. So if your goal is to write a book, the question is not, how do I find 3 hours a day to write? The question is, what do I already do every single day that I can attach 10 minutes of writing to? Maybe it is right after your morning coffee. Maybe it is immediately after you sit down at your desk. The specificity is everything. Now let us talk about a mistake that is even more common and even more damaging. Most people set outcome goals when they should be setting process goals. An outcome goal is, I want to lose 20 pounds. A process goal is, I will walk for 30 minutes after dinner 5 times a week. Here is why this distinction is so critical. You cannot fully control outcomes. You can control behaviors. And behaviors, compounded over time, produce outcomes. When your entire identity and motivation are attached to the outcome, every slow week feels like failure. Every plateau feels like evidence that you should quit. But when you are measuring your consistency with the process, progress is happening every single time you show up. This is where identity comes in, and this might be the most powerful lever in the entire system. Author James Clear, in his research on habit formation, makes a point that reframes everything. He argues that the most effective people do not set goals and then try to achieve them through willpower. Instead, they decide who they want to become, and then they ask what that person would do. The goal becomes evidence of the identity, not the identity's purpose. An athlete does not train to become fit. An athlete trains because they are an athlete. That is the mindset shift. When you start making decisions from identity rather than aspiration, behavior changes become self-reinforcing rather than effortful. Now here is where we need to talk about something that almost no goal-setting guide ever addresses: the role of your environment. A landmark study from the University of Southern California found that 43% of daily behaviors are performed habitually, in the same context, with little conscious thought. That means nearly half of what you do every day is driven not by your intentions but by your surroundings. Your desk. Your phone placement. The people you spend time with. If your environment is optimized for distraction and comfort, no amount of goal setting will overcome it. Want to read more books? Put the book on your pillow. Want to eat healthier? Move the fruit to eye level in the fridge and put the junk food in a cabinet you have to climb for. Want to exercise in the morning? Sleep in your workout clothes. These sound almost too simple. But the research is unambiguous. Reducing friction between you and the desired behavior is one of the highest leverage moves available to anyone trying to change their life. Let us also talk about the tracking problem. Most people either track too much or not at all. Tracking too much creates obsession and burnout. Tracking nothing means you have no feedback loop. The sweet spot is what researcher Teresa Amabo calls the progress principle. Her studies at Harvard found that the single biggest motivator for sustained performance is the perception of progress. Not rewards. Not recognition. Progress. Even small wins, when made visible, generate the kind of forward momentum that keeps people going through the difficult middle section of any goal. A simple weekly check-in where you know what you did and what you will do next is often more powerful than any elaborate tracking system. Now for the counterintuitive principle I mentioned at the beginning. Ready? The people who achieve the most are not the ones who stay fixated on their goals. They are the ones who are willing to adjust them. Rigidity is the silent killer of long-term success. When circumstances change, when new information arrives, when your values shift, a goal that made sense 6 months ago might be dragging you in the wrong direction today. The ability to reassess without feeling like you have failed is not weakness. It is strategic intelligence. High performers build regular review points into their systems specifically to ask the question, is this still the right goal, and is this still the right path to it? So let us bring it all together. Here is what actually works. First, get specific about what you want and attach it to a precise when and where. Second, shift your focus from outcome goals to process goals and measure your consistency, not just your results. Third, decide who you are becoming, not just what you are achieving. Fourth, engineer your environment so that the right behaviors require the least effort. Fifth, track progress visibly and celebrate small wins intentionally. And sixth, build in regular reviews to adjust without judgment. Goal setting is not about dreaming bigger.